The agenda for this presentation is the following. I will start by presenting what I mean with contingency planning. Then I will present some factors that affects the outcome of a crisis. Following this, I will then present some requirements for effective contingency planning. So if we start with what is contingency planning, or actually what I see as contingency planning, I define it as a continuous process that aims to build crisis management capabilities, abilities, readiness. People use different words. And this includes activities such as developing plans, conducting exercises, risk assessment, scenario analysis that we've just been talking a lot about. As I will come back to in this presentation, it's about creating and developing an ability. Thus, it is a continuous learning process. I will here start with presenting some important factors that shapes the crisis outcome. It is not just the planning that affects the outcome, but also other factors. But the purpose of presenting this right now is not just to show the picture of the challenging connection between planning and the outcome of a crisis. My argument here is that it's also increased the understanding of what effect. If you understand what affects the outcome of a crisis, you can also improve the planning. And I will now shortly go through these 6 factors. As we've already been into today, crisis comes in different forms. They vary in terms of speed, level of complexity, level of uncertainty, time scale, and so on. The variability in terms of crisis types indicates that the nature of the crisis itself will have a significant influence on the management of the outcome. If we, for example, look at the ongoing pandemic, we can clearly see the challenges with crisis that extends over such a long time period and affects everywhere and everyone. This can be compared to, for example, a forest fire that lasts for a much shorter time period and have an impact area. The capacities and constraints on leaders to take thus crisis decision are one of the most studied aspects of crisis management. What I want to point out here is that leaders during crisis, it is an extraordinary cognitive and emotional challenge. I mean, it's not easy. What is important to remember related to the outcome of the crisis is that who leads matters. Many leaders have basic skills, personality traits, and management style for how to handle the steady state, the normal conditions. But they may or may not be equipped with personality, background, previous education, and training for effective managing also a crisis. The response neither exists nor are deployed in a vacuum. They operate in institutional, organizational, and political system. There are thus immense variations in goals, structures, procedure, power distribution, resources, culture, trust, etc. This obviously has a major impact on the crisis outcome. If we look for different countries, there are also different regulation regimes with different legislation and jurisdiction, and this of course affects the response. If we go and look at the pandemic, we can, for example, see differences in how countries in the response work with rules and coercions versus voluntary guidelines to reduce the spread. What rules that can be implemented is different in different countries due to, for example, legislation. And I mean, it also depends on the culture for how you usually handle things in the different countries. Disaster response requires cooperation between organizations that maybe do not interact in their daily operations. This commonly results in complex coordination problems. It's well known from research, for example, Fritz in 1957, that volunteers, private citizen group, companies converge at a disaster and want to help. And who are involved in the response will, of course, have an effect on the outcome. After all crises, there are stories about how volunteers, citizens, etc. save the response. For example, during the large forest fire in Sweden in 2014, 3 volunteers actually built up the entire IT system for the multi-actor response organization. At the same time, there are stories of the opposite. For example, stories about how volunteers expose themselves to danger, which means that the response organization had to deal not only with the crisis, but also with the rescuing volunteers. Another example are supplies and gifts and such things that commonly converge at the disaster site. In this context, where we talk about food supply and food security, an example from my studies of forest fires comes to my mind. The people that work with food supply to the response organization, they described the large amount of food they received from the public, which was very helpful. But everything they received was not as good. For example, they described that one person came with a raw chicken, which maybe was not so suitable during a heat wave. They also point out that they got way too many goodies and not so much nutritious food that the people working needed. What is regarded as a success or a failure when it comes to crisis outcome is not obvious, but depends on who wins what is sometimes called the blame game and sometimes described as the framing contest. What this is about is that during a crisis, there is commonly a development of competing narratives about the cause of and thus the solution to the problem. The question is which narratives that takes hold. Furthermore, media also have a say in this. Media are today not only communicating disasters, disasters are constituted by media. Here you can also directly connect to the ongoing pandemic. What is described as a successful response or unsuccessful response seems to vary between newspapers, between persons, different countries, but also between different weeks and months. I will now move to a discussion of some requirements for effective contingency planning that is in some way affected by the factors I've just presented. This is a citation from one of the first interview studies or one of the first research study I've ever performed. I did interviews in a Swedish municipality that had been hit by a major storm. The interviewee were the preparedness planner, and that is the person responsible for crisis planning before the event. In this citation, he is talking about the contingency plan that they had developed before the storm. We tried to think of the worst that could affect a municipality like ours, but we could not imagine the extent of the catastrophe that actually occurred. Even if this was an interview that I did for more than 10 years ago, similar statements come up a little now and then in my research. And I mean, this is not just relevant for the local level. We always seem to fail with imagining the future. The discussion about the difficulties with imagining the future is quite common, both in the research community and in more popular community, science community. And we have mentioned this already today. We have Taleb and the concept black swans. We have Rumsfeld that made the concept unknown known famous. There is a researcher called Lee Clark that argue for the need to focus on possibilities and not just probabilities. He have written a whole book called Worst Cases, where he presents the most unlikely events that happen. And I mean, of course, we can't find them all before. This is also connected to that we need to plan for the future and not for the last war that we also talked about today. Of course, I mean, it's important to learn from the recent crisis, but it is all too often that we focus too much on the recent crisis in our planning for the future. Something that we can be pretty sure about is that the future is not a copy of what have already happened. In other words, we need to think broadly to plan for a breadth of different events, not just one event and not just the last event. We do not know what will happen in the future, as we've also been into. Thus, improvisation and creativity are important components in handling an emergency situation. And by this, successfully meeting the challenging demand, two researchers, Kendra and Wachtendorf, describe that improvisation is important and that preparedness serves as the backbone of disaster response efforts. Thus, preparedness can be seen as a backbone to improvise from. In the planning, we thus need to be open with the fact that we can't plan for every detail. Although we, of course, should have a plan, the planning needs to be designed so that we can improvise when needed. It is the process of planning that is important, not just the resulting plan. As Perrier and Lindell argue, while planning is an ongoing process, the physical plan can be seen as a snapshot of the process as a specific point of time. The very process of planning often brings together individuals and organizations that maybe do not normally work together to create mutual understanding, common purposes, and goals and trust, which also was mentioned by one of the earlier presenter. It's maybe not the specific thing we plan for, but just creating trust and common purposes and understandings are very important. And I mean, this is a way to understand different institutional and organizational settings. We also have to plan for integrating and handling different actors, and in this, not forget the citizens and volunteers that maybe arrive at the crisis. We should plan for cooperating with identified actors, but also plan for that people will convert at the disaster site, or there will be other actors that we imagine that will be involved. So we have to plan for how to cooperate and handle the actors that you cannot identify before the event. In addition, planning should be integrated and not just an add-on on a totally separate process. What resources that are put into proper planning are also important. Resources both in the form of staff and funding to carry out various activities. Linked to this is the interest that are in the question. Like other issues, crisis preparedness, contingency planning, I mean, it have to compete with other issues such as financing school or hospitals. And the question is always how much resources we should put into planning for something that may never happen. This area is sometimes described as a policy area without the public. That is an area which is not really focused on and where there are not too much interest until something happens. This makes it difficult for those who lead the preparedness process and those who are involved in it. It's also about the mandate of those who lead the process. One illustrative image of a preparedness plan that I got presented for me during an interview for a couple of years ago now was the preparedness planner. He was described as sitting far away in a corridor in the basement, far from everybody. And you can guess how much influence his work had on how much interest there were for preparedness planning in this organization. There is a need to put resources and money on preparedness planning, and we need people with competence and with support and we need support from the management. This is again a citation from one of my studies. It's a study I did a couple of years ago where I was interested in what actually happens with plans and risk analysis and etc. And this is a quite typical statement. It becomes a bit like a product that ends up in the folder. And you can guess my result is that, I mean, those documents mostly end up not used after shelf. And this result is actually not too surprising. After Heide wrote a book in 1989 where he, for example, talked about the paper plan syndrome. And there are also several other discussions in the literature about this. It's about the tendency to believe that disaster preparedness can be accomplished merely by the completion of a written plan. In my own studies, I've found that knowledge generated in the process are not transferred to others. The people that are supposed to use the plan or analysis they sometimes haven't even heard of it. I mean, of course they don't use it then. This is related to what I earlier pointed out, that the process of developing the plan, that's the important for developing preparedness. We need to put resources and developing ability and not just developing documents. To develop ability, there is a need for learning. I want to argue that preparedness should be viewed and designed as a learning process. A process where individuals learn, but it should not stay with the specific individuals who, for example, create the plan. It must also be transferred throughout the organization or to those people that needs to know it, or to those organizations. We need to learn from different activities. We need to work with learning from earlier experience, exercises, but also daily operations. There is a need to get to know each other before something happens to understand different organizational settings. We thus need to arrange learning activities such as exercises and not forget to evaluate and learn from them. Summing up, we should not think we will be able to imagine the future. We need to think broadly and plan for a breadth of different events. Improvisation will always be needed, so we should plan for that we need to improvise. We should focus on developing a process that is integrated and connected to other issues, a plan for both cooperating with known actors and the ones you have not identified beforehand. One must put resources on preparedness. And finally, planning needs to be seen and designed as a learning process for developing crisis management abilities. Thank you so much for listening.